How much was Manhattan actually sold for? Who really designed the American flag? A whole lot of the historical facts you were taught in school are nothing more than historical fiction. If there are two things people know about Marie Antoinette, it's that she was beheaded by the guillotine, and that, when warned that her subjects were running out of bread, she naively replied,
"Let them eat cake."
Well, there is no denying that Marie Antoinette was born into extreme privilege and likely had no comprehension of the horrors of starvation that her people faced. She almost certainly never said this particular phrase.
That's such nonsense. I would never say that.
While today almost everyone associates this phrase with Marie Antoinette, it actually has been attributed to many noblewomen throughout history long before the last Queen of France was even born. It's likely that the story became associated with Antoinette because it fit well with her reputation as a vapid rich woman from a foreign country who was sending France into debt. The philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau claimed that it had been spoken by a princess, and some mistakenly believed he was referring to her. Helen Keller was born in 1880, and she became both blind and deaf after falling ill at just 19 months old. Famously, a teacher named Anne Sullivan designed a curriculum to teach Keller to communicate. The story of her childhood is often shared with children as an example of overcoming adversity through hard work, but it's not always taught that, as an adult, Keller used her newfound voice to advocate for others. Keller was a devoted socialist and supporter of workers' rights, as well as an outspoken disability advocate. She wrote articles, gave speeches, promoted birth control when it was still highly controversial, and marched on picket lines. She educated people about the struggles disabled workers faced, particularly when their disabilities were caused by negligent employers. Keller went on to co-found the ACLU. As noted in a Time interview with Haben Girma, a black disability rights lawyer who is also deaf and blind, reducing the powerful advocate Helen Keller to a child still learning to talk is part of a larger cultural issue of infantilizing disabled adults. There are also clear political motivations for suppressing the most interesting and controversial facts about Keller's life in favor of a palatable, inspirational story. Even in her own time, Keller was investigated by the FBI for her activism, and some educators may be reluctant to present their students with such a radical hero. Many believe that the Plymouth colony pilgrims gathered their savior Squanto and his tribe together for a massive feast to thank them for their help in growing crops. This story, while beautiful, is a myth. The man known as Squanto was actually a Wampanoag man named Tisquantum, who had learned how to speak English after being enslaved by the British years before. Incredibly, he was able to escape. After working for a British merchant for many years, he negotiated his way back to his home. Tragically, the arrival of Europeans in his homeland had caused a horrendous epidemic that took the lives of tens of thousands. Without a family to return to, Tisquantum chose to help the pilgrims. The pilgrims really did have a harvest celebration, but they did not invite the local people as a sign of gratitude for Tisquantum's help. Instead, celebratory gunfire from the pilgrims caused a tense situation when the surviving Wampanoag interpreted it as an act of war. After the conflict was resolved, it's possible that the natives provided some food to the Plymouth colony, and as a specific, friendly, singular gathering, the first Thanksgiving celebrated today didn't likely happen. It's more likely that we memorialize several feasts of the pilgrims, including one that celebrated the Mystic Massacre, in which colonists killed several hundred Pequot people in Connecticut.
The gods of my tribe have spoken. They have said, do not trust the pilgrims.
It's a story that has been retold in textbooks for more than a century. In 1626, a representative from the West India Company purchased the island of Manhattan for a handful of beads worth $24. The real story is more complicated. The purchase of Manhattan is often incorrectly viewed as a kind of swindle, in which the Dutch dazzled the local people with foreign jewelry and tricked them into accepting a terrible price. In reality, the indigenous people who accepted beads as part of their trade deals were participating in a well-established trade strategy. They were also certainly worth more than $24. Today, the most common estimation is around $2,000. Whether or not the deal was actually a sale at all is still debated, as it's possible the price was actually intended to be more of a rental fee that would guarantee Dutch settlers the temporary right to hunt or live on the island. Some historians believe that the indigenous people who sold the land never actually owned it in the first place, and that they were actually the ones pulling the grift. The natives that agreed to the sale are thought to have been from a small village in modern-day Long Island, and they would have been more than happy to sell Manhattan, considering they didn't live there in the first place. Grigory Rasputin is probably one of the most mythologized historical figures in history. Many lies about Rasputin and his abilities come straight from the man himself, as he thrived on spreading misinformation and transforming himself into a legend. The most remarkable story may be that of his death, however, and that story was started by his assassin. The most widely known story of Rasputin's death was told by Felix Yusupov, the man who killed him. According to Yusupov, he had served Rasputin multiple glasses of wine and cyanide, to which the mad monk had proved completely immune. He claimed that he then shot Rasputin in the chest, but he still would not die. In order to make Rasputin stay dead, the assassin claimed that he finally had to drown him in the river. This remarkable story has remained immensely popular and is still the best-known account of Rasputin's death, but the autopsy report told a far more mundane story. The authorities found that Rasputin had been shot in the head, died, and had his lifeless body thrown into the river. It's likely that Yusupov made the event seem more dramatic to make himself seem more heroic.
I can assure you there is near consensus in the academic community regarding the death of Rasputin.
The popular story about Pocahontas that has fascinated generations comes directly from one of the main players, English colonial explorer John Smith. Smith claimed that he was captured by the Algonquin leader Powhatan and was set to be executed until Powhatan's beautiful daughter fell in love with him and begged for his life, but he was either mistaken or lying. Unlike the love-struck young woman John Smith described, Pocahontas was a curious, fun-loving, and intelligent child at the time, around 11 years old. She and John Smith really were close and taught each other their respective languages. Years later, Pocahontas was captured by the English. Although her father attempted to ransom her back, they had already given her a new English name and married her off to a man named John Rolfe. Whether or not Pocahontas agreed to the marriage is unknown. On the ship to England, Pocahontas died unexpectedly. Her father always suspected that she had been poisoned. It's unknown exactly why John Smith chose to misrepresent his relationship with Pocahontas, but his version of the story has endured. The phrase Mussolini made the trains run on time is often used to imply that living under a controlling fascist regime would at least be efficient. The ethics of that particular argument aside, the fact that it is based on isn't even true. The Italian transit system under Benito Mussolini was a total mess. The perception that the trains were particularly punctual was an active deception. As described by The Independent, the perception of efficiency under fascism was a piece of propaganda being actively spread by the regime. In addition to planting news stories about how fast and timely the trains were, tourists traveling through the country were put on trains specifically run to impress them. These were more frequently on time, but the trains that Italians actually used were much worse. The majority of Italian trains were poorly maintained, which often led to serious delays. Even the special tourist trains were regularly delayed. The railway system was actually so poor that it caused problems during World War II, as only about 20% of the trains that ran through the Alps were actually functional.
Trains must run on time. Chugga chugga chew.
Rosa Parks is best remembered for refusing to give up her seat on the bus, challenging segregation, and sparking the Montgomery bus boycott. Many have assumed that Parks was a tired old woman who decided she wasn't giving up her seat on a whim, but that was never the case. Parks herself is quoted by Women's History as clarifying, "People always say that I didn't give up my seat because I was tired, but that isn't true. I was not tired physically, or no more tired than I usually was at the end of a working day. I was not old, although some people have an image of me as being old then. I was 42. No, the only tired I was tired of giving in." When Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat, she was already a respected civil rights leader. Her choice to stay in her seat was a calculated decision and a brave act of protest, not a spontaneous decision. However, this protest was likely inspired by a different black woman's spontaneous decision. After learning about black history in school, 15-year-old Claudette Colvin refused to submit to the racist policy on her local bus by giving up her seat for a white passenger. In an interview with NPR many years later, Colvin stated, "It felt like Sojourner Truth was on one side pushing me down, and Harriet Tubman was on the other side of me pushing me down. I couldn't get up." In popular culture, gladiator fights are usually depicted as no-rules battles to the last man standing. These fights certainly could be gruesome, and people did die in the Colosseum. But contrary to popular belief, gladiator fighting had rules just like any other sport. Usually that included avoiding killing your opponent. As described in James Grout's Encyclopedia Romana, there were executions in the Colosseum, particularly of criminals and unrelenting Christians. Professional gladiators sometimes were killed during their fights, but it is estimated that they had an average 90% chance of surviving every time they entered the arena. As violent as they were, gladiator fights weren't without rules. In fact, each fight is believed to have had a pair of highly respected referees observing to ensure that all of the fighters were following the rules. As described by historian Sarah Emily Bond, these early umpires had the authority to disqualify any gladiator that performed an illegal action.
Are you not entertained? Are you not entertained? Is this not why you are here?
President George Washington and his wife Martha personally claimed hundreds of men, women, and children as property. It is commonly believed that although he relied on the exploitation of enslaved people throughout his life, he privately disagreed with the institution and ordered that all the people enslaved on his estate be freed upon his death. Reality is more complicated. It is true that in George Washington's will, he expressed the desire to release the enslaved people who had been forced to serve him throughout his life. However, he also stated that their freedom would be granted upon his wife's death if he died first. Also, his will only stipulated the freedom of his own slaves. Martha Washington came into the marriage with slaves of her own, many of whom remained in bondage for the rest of their lives after being passed down through the generations. George Washington's will did stipulate the release of a single man upon his death, a Revolutionary War hero named William Lee. A year after her husband's death, it is believed that Martha came to fear that the estate's slaves might rise up against her, so she finally granted the people her husband had enslaved their freedom. One of the most popular stories of the Revolutionary War features the seamstress Betsy Ross fashioning the very first American flag at the request of George Washington. However, it's exactly that, a story. There was a real woman named Elizabeth Ross during the American Revolution, but there's no reason to think that she had anything to do with the flag.
Because the story of me sewing the first American flag is unsupported poppycock.
In reality, the original American flag was likely designed by New Jersey Continental Congressman Francis Hopkinson. The real Betsy Ross was a Quaker woman from New Jersey who was kicked out of her community for marrying a Protestant. She and her husband ran an upholstery business together in Philadelphia until he was killed in the war. The church that the widowed Ross attended was popular with the founding fathers, with at least 15 well-known members of the Continental Congress attending regularly. It is true that Ross produced flags, among other goods, for the Continental Army, but it wasn't until several decades after her death that the legend of the flag's creation appeared, likely invented by her grandson.